Hi there. Welcome to the Sober Circle channel. Enjoy this speaker tape.
This recording is part of the Northern California tape library about alcoholism. It was recorded on April the 18th, 1987 at the 16th Annual Reno Spring Festival of Alcoholics Anonymous, held in Reno, Nevada. The speaker, Ray O'Keefe of Miami, Florida. Please observe the provisions of Alcoholics Anonymous and do not play this recording for entertainment or commercial purposes. And please do not break the anonymity of the speaker or any AA member at any public level. The original recording and this copy were both made by Bart Daniel of 1332 Santa Ynez Way, Sacramento, California, zip 95816.
Miami, Florida. He's come a long way. Ray O.
My name is Ray O'Keefe. I'm an alcoholic. I've been in Alcoholics Anonymous for a long time. You can tell by looking at me I've been somewhere for a long time. It's good to be back in this area. I was at Fallen Leaf a few years ago. I forget when it was, but it's good to be back. I've met some people here that I've met before, met many new friends, and I had a chance to meet again with Cliff and Jim and Holly and Sue and meet Lorraine. I was surprised all those Al-Anons with you today, Lorraine. I didn't think there would be so many there because they were having a meeting on the other side of town in the mother church of all Al-Anon today, the Church of Our Lady of Perpetual Revenge. Let me tell you about my drinking. This is a thrill. I don't want you to miss any of it. I grew up in one of the neighborhoods in New York City, and my neighborhood was rough, and it was tough, and it was Irish. Now, they actually drank in that neighborhood. You may not understand that here in Nevada, but you would see people on the street under the influence of alcohol. Difficult to believe. If you looked at where I lived, you'd see a little drinking. My mother, the widow O'Keefe, was known to take a drink from time to time. And when the pressure would get on, Kitty would go for the light wines and the spirits. And something would fly, usually the children. My brother Billy, on the other hand, was a very bad drunk. And in the neighborhood of Irish drunks, Billy O'Keefe stood out. So when I showed up at the local place and ordered up whatever it was they were serving 14-year-olds that afternoon, no one paid any attention to me. It was just another O'Keefe coming through the system. I don't really remember what they gave me. I suspect it was a beer. That was the neighborhood drink. But whatever it was, I liked it. Just like Cliff, I loved it. I liked everything about it. I liked the way it looked. And I liked the way it smelled. And I liked the way it tastes. And I liked what it did for my head. And I liked the noise and the smoke and the confusion. And I liked the fist fights and the Irish music. I liked the bullshit. That's what I really liked. And I spent the next 20 years going at it. I was going through the parochial school system, in a manner of speaking, and I got into all of the difficulties you might imagine a young man would get into.
I held the neighborhood record for being thrown out of high school, a record previously established by my brother Billy. When I was finished with high school, or more properly, when they were finished with me, because someone made a mistake in a small school in New England, I got a chance to leave the neighborhood, and I went away to college. And my drinking changed. My drinking always changed when I moved. In the neighborhood, we drank beers, and we drank shots and beers, and we called those bats and balls. Well, when I got north, they weren't drinking that way. There were no bars in that state, just restaurants. And these people sat around at tables, and they drank beer out of bottles, and they sang college songs, and they wore white shoes in the wintertime. And being a man of no particular moral fiber, I got a pair of white shoes. I learned the words to some of those dopey songs, I got very collegiate. World War II was just about over, and things were safe. So one day I got a haircut and joined the Navy. And I ended up on a minesweeper in San Francisco. And I hate to be indelicate in front of so many people, but I have to tell you, I had a lot of trouble with my kidneys when I drank. And in the Navy, we slept 3 to a tier. Do not get ahead of me. This is not easy what I am doing here. I came back from my first liberty in the city of San Francisco with all the beer in me I could buy, and I went to sleep, and I had one of these attacks. And I met the fellow that slept below me that night. I suppose he thought he'd be wet sometime in his naval career. It just hadn't occurred to him it would happen while he was sleeping. I was immediately transferred to a lower bunk. The rest of my naval career was undistinguished, and I returned home to the neighborhood undecorated, unhonored, unloved, and everything was under control in the neighborhood. The widow was out in the weeds somewhere. My brother Billy was absent without leave from the New York City Police Department. Billy had become a policeman and had invited a citizen of the Puerto Rican ancestry off a 5-story roof. And the citizen had bounced and lived to identify the Irish cop. So Billy went west, went into a more peaceful line of work. He went back in the Marine Corps. The government was giving veterans $20 a week for 52 weeks. I qualified for a few checks. I gravitated to the local place, and I took up the game of shuffleboard. And I was planning a life of petty crime with some of my boyhood companions. When I had one of those clear thoughts that come every once in a while, I remembered I'd been to college. So I got on a bus, and I went back up there, and I arrived in the middle of a blizzard, and I walked into this place, and there they were, sitting around the table, drinking beer out of a bottle, singing those songs, wearing those shoes. So I got another pair of shoes. And now a grateful government was giving me a check every month, so I was moderately solvent and therefore drunk all the time. And one day I was staggering around the campus in my usual condition, and I noticed a list of names on a bulletin board of people who were qualified to graduate. And my name was on the list. And that was good news. I thought I had another year to go. I notified the widow of this great event, and she came north, and that was a very tender sight. The widow and her youngest child staggering around under the elms. About 10 years later, I served as a trustee of that college, and I go to meetings, and they were still talking about my mother. It isn't often in the state of Vermont that they see a little old lady get off a train drunk at 9 o'clock in the morning. Sort of a landmark. When I got back home to the neighborhood after college, the question was what to do, and I had a bunch of Irish uncles who ran the family, and they had voted unanimously that I become a New York City policeman, because that's what my father had been, and that's what my brother had been, and that's what all my cousins and my uncles were doing, except for the 2 morons that worked for the telephone company. But I told them I had my own plans, and I didn't want to be a cop, and I told them I'd received a scholarship to law school, and I'd be unemployed for the next several years. And that was received with mixed emotions. And that's what happened. I went to law school. I didn't know anything about law school. We didn't have any lawyers in my neighborhood. We had cops and we had priests. We didn't need any lawyers. I hate to be disloyal to the profession that's done so well for me, but I have to tell you, When I got to law school, I found I was in the company of the greatest collection of stiffs that had ever assembled under one roof. These guys were deadly. They all wore a suit and they all wore eyeglasses. So as soon as I got into uniform and I got a pair of glasses I didn't need, I looked around for a companion, someone to drink with. But nobody drank in that crowd. They were all studying. They were all grinding it out. So I went on the wagon. I stopped drinking for the first year of law school, and I drank very rarely in the next 2 years. And the result of all of that was I did well in law school. And when I came out, I was taken in to a large, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, Wall Street law firm. They hired me as sort of the resident immigrant. It was not a total loss, however. I did learn to say, "Oh, really," instead of "no shit." Very bad, aren't they? My superiors there determined that I should be trained as a trial lawyer, and so I was sent up to the courthouse in New York City to learn my trade. And I wasn't in the courthouse very long when I discovered that all the smart guys were across the street in a saloon. So I moved my office into the saloon, and I learned to drink in a different, a more civilized, a more genteel fashion. Very few members of the profession were knocking down bats and balls where anybody could see them. I discovered scotch in a tall glass with water and ice. You sip on that. It takes a little while, but it gets the job done. I was introduced to all of the mysteries and all of the rituals that surround the very, very dry martini. And to this evening and to this minute, my love, my affection, and my admiration for the very, very dry martini is surely the greatest case of unrequited love the world has ever seen. I was so loyal to those things, and they almost destroyed me. After about a year of this civilizing influence, it was necessary in my natural development that I be married, and I had located this lady, or she had located me. Who knows how that works? I was working in a hotel as a bellhop one summer, and she was a guest, and that pretty well characterizes the relationship right now. We settled down, and she began to produce children in a very boring and monotonous fashion, and with the regularity that's known only to the devout Roman Catholic. And a couple of years later, I received a phone call from the law school I had attended, and I was told to go see the dean, so I reported to the dean, and he appointed me to the faculty, and I became Professor O'Keefe. And there I was, the boy professor. And I was nervous about that type of a position, and I knew that I drank too much, so I resolved that I would drink less, and I went into a phase of controlled drinking. I was then about 27 years of age when I thought I'd have to control my drinking, and I was very bad at that. I just wasn't able to do it much. But as the teaching years went by, it occurred to me after a couple of years that I was able to do that type of work. I was all right. And I was a good teacher, and therefore there was no reason not to drink. So I went back out to drink the way I wanted to drink. I only knew one way how to drink. My father died when I was 2, and my brother Billy was 4 years older, and he was not at all like me. He was a big, tall, handsome, athletic guy. And he was my hero. And I did everything, or tried to do everything, just like Billy. And I drank just like Billy. I drank until I fell down, or the place went on fire, or the cops arrived, or something would happen to interfere with the drinking. I used to see people leaving. I'd wonder where the hell they were going. The whiskey's here. They're going out the door. Huh? In this period of time, too, I did a lot of other things that are no longer important, and because I had this job, I served on all kinds of commissions and committees, and I was in the periphery of a lot of politics, and even ran for office one time and lost. The only thing I can look back on now with any memory at all is I was in a group of men who very, very early surrounded the candidacy of a young senator from Massachusetts that you will remember. And in this period of time, too, Mr. O'Keefe and I bought a large, semi-authentic colonial home in a village called Larchmont, New York, a village which abounds in semi-authentic colonial homes. And we had it up to 6 or 7 kids, and the usual number of motor vehicles, and a nice house, and I belonged to a number of clubs, and I was a member of a law firm, and I was a professor of law, and I was a politician. And had you asked me in those days how I was doing, I would have told you I was doing very well. As a matter of fact, I would have told you I was doing very well whether you asked me or not. But by this time, at age 34, I had turned into a daily drunk, and my day would have killed an ordinary man. I used to come to in the morning in that wet sack because the problem with the kidneys had continued unabated all those years. And I would struggle out of that wet sack, and I would begin my morning aerobics. My aerobics were performed kneeling on the floor of a bathroom with my head in a bowl. And I would have all the water running, the water in the shower, and the water in the tub, and the water in the sink, because I did not want Mrs. O'Keefe and all of those little O'Keefes to know that Professor O'Keefe was dying. I would come downstairs in my sincere blue suit, carrying over my shoulder, much like Santa Claus, a sack of wet laundry, because Mrs. O'Keefe told me that the diaper service was for the children, and she did not think that a lady of her extreme breeding ought to do the wash of a 34-year-old bedwetter. You can imagine a man of my stature in the community starting off each morning with a load of wash. But once I got my wash out of the way, help was at hand. I kept a quart of vodka in the refrigerator. My children call that Daddy's juice. And I would take a few bangs out of Daddy's juice, and then the question was, would I throw up in front of all these people? I knew if I lit up a cigarette, it was all over. Sooner or later, I'd take a train into New York City, and it'd arrive at Grand Central. I don't know how much you know about Grand Central, but it's really not a railroad terminal. It is a collection of saloons that are connected by tunnels. And I would tear around the tunnels and pop up like a mole here or there and do a repair job. And then I'd head up to the school, and as soon as I got into that imposing institution, my first thought was how to get out. And I'd get out, I'd tear across town and steal. Every morning I'd steal money from the petty cash at the firm. And then I'd go down to the bar by the courthouse to meet my friends and to discuss professional matters. And then I'd buy a drink, and they'd buy a drink, and the bartender would buy a drink, and we'd all buy a drink, and it was a wonderful way to operate. And I had it figured out in some peculiar alcoholic way that I was particularly brilliant at 2 o'clock. So I'd schedule classes for 2, and I'd zoom up there with a load, and I would shortchange those poor little children who had come to study law at my feet. And then I'd zoom out of there and go over to Grand Central to commute. Now, even though I grew up in the neighborhood, I knew the theory of commuting. Commuters are entitled to a drink before they get on the train. So I'd have 10 or 12, and I would take a train going north. I didn't have to necessarily go to Larchmont. North was good enough for me. Got to see a great deal more of Connecticut than I wanted to. Sooner or later, I'd get back home, and I'd arrive with a full load and bounce off a few walls. and take what was left of Daddy's juice out of the refrigerator and fill up an old cheese glass that some kid had left laying around, and ask if anybody wanted a martini. But I was the only one that drank in that house in those days. Most nights I would have dinner. It depended on my mood. Evenings I would spend in civic endeavor. Lawyers are very fond of civic endeavor. Civic endeavor by me was cracking up the car or puking on some hostess's sofa or playing a little grab-ass with the ladies of Larchmont and a sorrier-looking crop you have never seen. Most nights I would just stay home and vegetate, and I'd watch television with one eye like that, trying to get those sets to come together. And I'd sit there. And I'd watch the television with one eye, and I would drink, and I would go through the programming and through the news and on into the morning, and finally my big moment would come when they played the national anthem. And the Marines would go up Mount Suribachi, and the destroyers would be coming through the water, and they'd be playing that song, and I would cry. Oh, I would cry and sob and weep. Then I'd go upstairs and wet the bed, and that's it. Another wonderful day. Weekends I would save for binges. And if everybody around me would mind their own business, which was extremely rare, I could get drunk 3 times on Saturday and 3 times on Sunday. Well, as anybody who's ever been married can tell you, while all of this was going on, Mrs. O'Keefe was not entirely silent. From time to time, she would have the temerity to suggest that there was something radically wrong with the way I drank. But I would explain to her the relativity of drinking, which is to say that some people drink more than other people. And I would have to explain these things to her because she is not an attorney. And I would say on a relative scale, I'm not a very big drinker. As a matter of fact, I would say, I don't drink as much as my mother. And she would say, nobody drinks as much. Then I'd have to leave for a few days and go visit Mom. Well, this drove her wacky, and she betook herself to her physician, who, as you might imagine, is an obstetrician. And he could discover nothing the matter with her until she told him she lived with a drunk. And this explained things to him. So he sent her home to me with a message. And in this house where it was a very nice house, we had a room. It was a den, very nice. And on the wall of that room, I had erected a shrine. And this shrine was not to any saint that you ever heard of. This shrine was to me. And there were pictures of O'Keefe with the great and the near great, and there were diplomas and plaques and proclamations and letters, you know, dear Ray, best regards, Jack, that kind of stuff. And I was very happy there, and I'd watch the television with my, and I would drink. And then when the commercials come, I'd look up at the shrine, and I'd say, you're doing a hell of a job, and I'd have another drink. Well, Mrs. O'Keefe came to visit the shrine this evening, and the message she brought me was that her physician, the obstetrician, had diagnosed her husband, the law professor, as an alcoholic. Oh, I was so upset. I immediately rose to defend myself, as was my custom, and I launched into one of my jury sermons. And the first point I made, it's still a good point, I think. I took a very, very dim view of a physician who would diagnose a patient without having seen the patient. I was against that shabby type of medical practice, all too common in our country today. And then I asked Mrs. O'Keefe a question to which she has not yet discovered the answer. I asked her what type of a man became an obstetrician in the first place. You got that one? You got it? And at this point, the conversation was coming downhill at a terrible rate. And then it happened. I don't know how this happened. I cannot explain to you how this happened. It happened. I can't explain it. I can explain many, many other things to you, and I probably will in the second or third hour of this great talk I'm giving here. But in the middle of all this noise and confusion, I suddenly stopped, and I admitted to that woman, the first time I'd ever admitted to anyone, that there was at least the possibility that I drank too much sometimes. This was a very serious tactical error. Because 3 days later, I was a prisoner in a mental institution in Stamford, Connecticut. And I was only there a matter of moments when I discovered a very serious architectural deficiency in the building. There was no doorknob on my side of the door. They had sandbagged the old professor. And I was overcome with great feelings of outrage and self-pity because in addition to everything else bad that was going on that day, it happened to be the occasion of my 35th birthday. And I mentioned this to a man in a white coat who was passing through. And I very carefully explained to that cretin that on that very day I had attained age 35, and therefore, under the Constitution of the United States of America, I was eligible for the office of President. He urged me not to plan any campaigns. He said there were 2 other presidents in residence. And they didn't want any trouble with security. And he went away and he left me. And then for the next week or so, I did all of those warm, wonderful, happy, and interesting things that alcoholics do when they withdraw from alcohol. I shook. I sweat. I did everything else pleasant that you can think about. And I finally came up for air, and I was visited by the staff of the hospital who were, of course, psychiatrists. And I gave 3 different psychiatrists 3 different stories. And the next day they told me that I was in grave danger of being expelled from a mental institution. They said I was not cooperating. And I was cooperating. I was playing Monopoly with 3 guys who were there. They weren't alcoholics. They were just there. And one of them was under the impression that I was his real estate broker. If you know anything about the game of Monopoly, and some nut thinks you're his real estate broker, you can do very, very well. And I had the boardwalk. I had a number of hotels, and I certainly was enjoying not drinking, and there was hope there. And about the 3rd day of the Monopoly marathon, they said I had a visitor. I didn't know what that would be, so I went into my large executive-type padded cell, and I waited for this visitor, and through the door of that room came this very imposing-looking guy, and he said he was from the Darien, Connecticut group of Alcoholics Anonymous, that the hospital had given up on me, and they had asked him to speak to me of our program. And I immediately reverted to my origins in the neighborhood because I almost had him by the throat. I said, Alcohol, what are you, out of your mind? And he told me to shut up. I immediately forgave him because I understood that they had neglected to tell him who I was. So I began to tell him who I was. He told me to sit down and to shut up and to listen to him. Well, he was an imposing-looking person, and I was not well. So for the first time in 35 years, I sat and he began to explain to me, as I have been trying to indicate to you, and as we are instructed in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, what his life had been like, how he had come to this program, and what life had been for him since. And he asked me if I would like to go with him to meetings. And I said, do you mean outside to meetings, sir? He said, outside. I said, I'll go. And besides that, he gave me matches. No one else had allowed me to have any matches. So that's how it began with me. That was in 1963. And he took me all around, and I began to attend meetings locally, and I don't remember so much of all of that. I was too new and too nervous and too afraid and too everything. And besides, the hospital had turned me loose with a large jar of those pills that they used to insist on giving alcoholics. I was dealing with that lethal segment of the medical profession that considers the disease of alcoholism to be caused by some type of a Valium deficiency. And I walked around and my head buzzed a lot. But I know myself fairly well. I figured I'd come to Alcoholics Anonymous. You would recognize me as a superior person. You would elect me your president. I was always president if I joined something. I would serve a term as your president. We would have a dinner. You would give me a plaque. I would hang it on the wall of the shrine, and that's another day. Well, it didn't work out that way, and I'm sure it comes as no surprise to you, although it was a terrible shock to me, to find out some 10 months later I was drunk. And this time, of course, I was drunk with a great difference, because I had turned away from the great power that is in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was to stay drunk for a period of time, and I won't take you through all of that. It still makes me nervous when I think about it. But just let me indicate to you, it was without question the worst period of my life. It was murder. It was pure and simple murder. I never knew when I would begin drinking, and I never knew where I'd be when I finished drinking. I would drink a week, and then I wouldn't drink a month. I'd drink a month, then I wouldn't drink a week. I would drink and come to these meetings. I would come to these meetings, and then I would drink. Things began to happen to me in this period of time that had never happened to me before. And I do not speak to you now of things that happened to me in this period of time that I no longer consider to be significant. I do not speak to you now of the fact that I was dismissed from the faculty and fired as a tenured professor of law, and that all of the honors and all of the appointments and all of the commissions and all of the dollars that went with that position were taken from me in about 15 minutes. I do not speak to you of the fact that I was in serious, and I mean very serious, personal, professional, and financial difficulties. I do not even speak to you of the fact that I had lost the affection of all those who were around me. All of this happened to me in this period of time, but that is not what I am speaking to you about. What I now understand was happening to me then was that there was, in my case, and perhaps in yours, a terrible, terrible disintegration of my spirit. My spirit, that thing that separates me from my cat, or separates me even from each of you. That spirit which gives to this particular form whatever individuality or personality or character that it might have. And this was a spirit which once burned in me so bright. And it was extinguished, and I knew it, and there was nothing I could do about it. I had been here, and this did not work for me. And by this time, I've been everywhere else, believe me. I've been through the hospitals and the doctors and the nurses and the farms and the sanitariums, and I've been through the jobs and the politicians and the friends and the money, and I've been up and down every avenue there was. And the answer was always the same. I was drunk. And it wasn't as though I didn't know about drinking. I knew about drinking. I knew about it. I had a memory. I remembered the neighborhood. I knew what happened to people who went bad with the booze. I knew about my family. I had been to the funerals. I knew what was waiting for someone like me. And if I gave this any thought at all, as the book tells us, self-knowledge doesn't avail us anything. Self-knowledge is destructive. If I gave this any thought at all, I guess I thought, well, if this is the way it is, this is the way it is. And I continued to drink. And truly, truly, as I am before you, I never thought that I could stop drinking. Never. And then one day, my time came. My time came one day. My time came. I don't know any more about this than you do, but it seems to me that there is a time for all of us. And it seems to me that there is a time for each of us. I say to you that there is a line somewhere beyond which we are simply not permitted to go. And I say to you that there is a point somewhere below which we are not permitted to sink. And I say to you that there is a level of pain somewhere beyond which no human is required to endure. Now, I don't know where this line is for you. I only know what happened to me. And this is an individual and a personal thing. And it is different in each case. And for some, it may be death. And that's the way it was for my brother Billy. They called one night from the Veterans Hospital in Minneapolis, and the man said that my brother was dead of alcoholism. He had died in the Veterans Hospital because that's where they had taken him when he had collapsed on the skid row of Minneapolis. And so, my brother and my hero died the way alcoholics oftentimes do, without friends, without family. And he was a long way from our neighborhood. But my brother Billy doesn't drink anymore. And that's how he stopped. And for other people it can be something fairly trivial. But that line is there. somewhere. And we all come to it, I think, in our own time and in our own way. But we get there. And I arrived at a day that wasn't so very different from so many other days, and I had no idea what was going on. I was 2 or 3 days away from a drink. I was in this place where I worked. I was nervous. I was thirsty. I was about to get a drink, and it occurred to me, and I was given the great opportunity and the great grace to call a longtime friend of mine who is a longtime member of our program. His name is John, and he is my sponsor. And I told him what was going on with me, and he said he'd be right over, and he came over. And he walked into that room, and he looked so good. And I felt so bad. And I asked him what I would have to do to be as successful as he was in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And John gave me that look that he has. And he said, don't drink. And go to the meetings. You'll be all right. Well, I didn't want him to tell me that. So I had a lot of problems. So I told him I didn't want him to tell me that. I said, you don't understand the problem. I said, look at this place where I work. I shouldn't be in a place like a lawyer of my talent in a dump like this. Well, he said, don't drink. You go to meetings. That'll be better. I said, at home it's worse. I'm not allowed to go up there anymore. Yeah, he said, well, don't drink. And so, you go to meetings. I'll be all right. I said, I'm being sued by Bankers Trust. He said, I heard about that one. Well, don't drink, and you'll get to a meeting, you'll be all right. I sensed that there was no dialogue there. He was just like Cliff's sponsor. He still is. He's a character. I would say to him, I don't feel well. He'd say, well, this may be as well as you ever feel. I said, and when am I going to get a good job? He said, you had one. I said, what am I going to do? I'm in big trouble. He said, hang on. I said, well, how do you hang on? He said, let go. I said, how's everything? I said, my wife. He said, wait. Anything about your wife in the big book? I said, I don't think so. He said, then it's not important. Great man. So there we were in the office, and he made a couple of phone calls. He said, come on, you're not doing anything. And he stuck me on a train up to Lachman. It's about 40 minutes up, and halfway up I reconsidered. You understand? What the hell did I call him for? I must have panicked. Don't drink, right? Don't drink my ass, you know? Wait till this train stops. And I got off the train, and standing on the platform of that station was my mailman. The guy used to deliver the mail. His name was Al. And he was then chairman of the local AA group. And Al said, get in the car. And I said, I don't hang out with mailmen. He said, some guy called me about you. Get in the car. Well, a man of my stature cannot afford to have a fist fight with a mailman or anybody else, for that matter. He'd get killed. So I got in Al's car. I said, Al, I got an awful lot of problems. Yeah, he said, well, don't drink. You'll go to a meeting then. So if any of you think because I'm from out of town I know a lot about what's going on here, you want some advice? Don't drink. You go to the meetings. You'll be fine. Just forget all that other crap, will you please? Just don't drink and go to the meetings. You'll be fine. Al took me up to the group that night, and I didn't drink. And I haven't had a drink since. And that was November 24th, 1965. And first I had that day. Before the years, I had that day. And I had that day because two members of this fellowship were so filled with the gratitude of this fellowship that they took what God sent that day. A drunken, dishonest, arrogant man. And because they were so very, very grateful for what the program had given them, they gave me a day. They made me the gift of a day. Because of that day, all the other days have seemed to follow. And they started me off by going to meetings every day. And I still go to meetings every day. I don't miss. I go every single day. I don't know that I can stay sober any differently than the way I got sober. I don't think there's any graduation. I go every day. And I would get my instructions from John and from Al. And I'd been around 3 or 4 months or so, and said to John one time, "How about those steps?" He said, "They're for us." He said, "You're a tourist." He said, "You've been here before. Who knows how long you're going to stick around? Get in the car and be quiet." Well, a couple of more months, he said to me, "You know the trouble with you?" I said, "No, please. Quickly tell me what the trouble is with me. I'm so anxious you should tell me this." He said, "The trouble with you is you're ignorant." I said, "Thank you so much. May I inquire as to the nature of my ignorance?" He said, "You don't know anything about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, you dummy." He said, "You're hanging around 6 months. You hang around pretty good. You shoot your mouth off all the time. You don't know anything about the program." He said, "You think Alcoholics Anonymous is to keep you from drinking." He said, "You are a moron." Oh, I said, "I did think that was part of it. Yes. He said, "It has nothing to do with drinking, stupid. Read the book." He said, "Read the book." I said, "I have read the book." He said, "Read the book." I said, "I'll read the book." He said, "Read it again." I said, "Yes, John." He said, "There was no conversation was ever over with that man unless I said, 'Yes, John.'" That's when he knew that it was all right. The conversation was then all over. If I said, "Yes, John," I was on the phone, I'd hear click. Or if I said, "Yes, John," he'd disappear. Soup, he's gone. So I started to read again the book Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a terrible thing to say. The man was right. I didn't know anything about the program. I just thought you weren't supposed to drink. I didn't understand that that book had been written some 5 years after Bill met Bob. Didn't know that in the course of that 5 years, 100 or so men and women had become sober. Didn't know that the steps that are contained in the 5th chapter of that book that were read to us tonight were steps literally taken by these men and women as they became sober. I thought if I said I was Ray O'Keefe and I was an alcoholic, I was doing something about the first step. Well, that's my name, and I'm an alcoholic, but the men and women who founded our program did a great deal more than simply identify themselves as alcoholics. They admitted that they were powerless over alcohol, that their lives had become unmanageable. And their lives had become unmanageable because they were powerless over alcohol. It was all one thing with them. They were powerless. They had no power. They were without power. It tells us in the book that the dilemma of the alcoholic is his lack of power. He has no power. He is powerless. And they didn't drink. And time began to pass for them. And time has passed for me. And time has passed for the wonderful spring conference at Reno. And for those of you who stood before who are here new, time will pass for you. Time has a wonderful way of passing in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. It passes one day at a time. And somewhere after this succession of days, these men and these women came to believe that there was a power greater than their own. And they believed that this power, greater than their own, could restore them to sanity. And this was not just a casual observation that they made. They believed this. This was part of them. They believed, and I believe, that there is a power much greater than my own. And I believe that that power can restore me to sanity. And so firm and so real and so true was that belief that they made a decision. They made a decision as to how they will live. They made a decision to turn over the will and the life to the care of this power that they had come to believe in, this God as they each understood him. And they were very, very bright. Because at a time in the history of our country when no one else had this notion, they considered alcoholism to be a disease. They considered it to be a disease that was physical and mental and spiritual, a disease of the body and of the mind and of the spirit. And when they stopped drinking, their bodies responded quickly. And when they came to believe that there was help and hope here, they enjoyed a mental recovery. It was slower than the physical recovery, but it was perceptible. They could notice it. And when they made that decision, that was the key that opened the door. When they made that decision, they began not only a spiritual recovery, they laid down the basis for a spiritual way of life. And they are also smart enough that they knew that it isn't enough to stop drinking and start praying. A lot of people have tried that. It doesn't work. They knew that if they were to be successful, somehow they would have to change. And in order to effect this change in themselves, they began a searching and fearless moral inventory of themselves. They could be searching because now they were clear. They could be fearless because they had made a decision to place their life into the care of this God as they understood him. Imagine an alcoholic without fear. That's impossible. It embarrasses me to tell you that the ruling emotion of my life when I drank was fear. And it was a fear that amounted to terror. And for all of those years, the great man and the boy professor was afraid most of the time. But this program helps with that. And when they were finished with that inventory, so great was the love and the affection of these people, one for the other, as I observe you and the love and the affection of you people, one for the other. They were able to take this inventory and to readmit it to the God of their understanding, to themselves, and they took it to someone else. It was a great relief for me to take this and go through it with my sponsor. It was he who made clear to me the exact nature of my wrongs. And then they developed an attitude which was difficult for me. They became entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And with compelling logic, they went to that great power that they had come to believe in, and they asked that power, please, humbly, to remove their defects of character and their shortcomings. And they did that in the form of a prayer. And they asked their Creator to take from them everything, good and bad, which stood in the way of their being useful to Him and to their fellows. And it began to work for them. And it's worked for millions of people since. And anyone who's ever had any doubt that this program works All they have to do is come to this conference right now and stand in the middle of this room and take a look around. It works. Works for everybody. They knew they had not come here alone. They knew in their lives, as in mine, there was an awful lot of wreckage. So they wrote a list of everyone they had ever harmed. They became willing to make amends to everybody on the list. They didn't just talk about it. They went out and they did it. You may remember in our literature it tells us Bob's first day when he tried to stop drinking. He got back home late that night. Bill asked him where he'd been. And he said he was driving around Akron, Ohio in his old Buick, mending fences. It's an old Vermont expression. He was making amends the very first day that he stopped drinking. And I don't think we need wait so long in this program to do all the things that are required of us, especially when the benefits are so great. It tells us in the book that if we are painstaking about this phase of our development, we will be amazed before we are halfway through. It says we are going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. It says we will not regret the past or wish to shut the door upon it. That we will comprehend the word serenity and we will know peace. It says no matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experience will benefit others. That feeling of selfishness will leave us. Self-seeking will slip away. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Fear of people and of economic insecurity will leave us. We will suddenly realize that God is doing for us all of the things we could not do for ourselves. Are these extravagant promises? We think not. They are being fulfilled among us, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. They will always materialize if we work for them. And I am able to report to you that each and every one of those promises has come into my life, wholly, solely, and simply because I am a member of this program. And by this time, these people, these men and women, were sober. And the book tells us there had been a restoration of sanity. And they understood that what had been given freely to them was something very, very precious. And so they resolved that they would maintain it. And in order to maintain it, they continued to take personal inventory. They knew they could not enjoy the luxury of a resentment. They knew they could not be resentful or hateful. They knew if they were hateful or resentful, they would drink. And if they drank, they would surely die. And so when they were wrong, they promptly admitted that they were wrong. And so real, so true, was their reliance upon a power greater than their own, that they resolved to improve their conscious contact with God. And they did that by prayer and by meditation. They meditated. They gave thought to their condition. They considered who they were and what they were. And they engaged in a very fine, a very excellent form of meditation. It is the form of meditation in which you are now engaged. They listened. They listened. On the odd chance that this power would speak to them. And this power did speak to them in their groups, at their meetings. And then they prayed, brothers. They prayed. Nobody needs a sermon from me on the value of prayer. When they prayed only for knowledge of God's will for them and the power to carry that out. I can never tell how it was with you. But I have heard this many, many times. I heard it this weekend 3 times. I had this awful feeling from the time I was very, very young that I did not belong. I really believed it. I knew I was in the wrong family. I did not belong with that bunch. I did not belong in that kind of a neighborhood. I did not fit into those schools. I just didn't belong with these people all my life. And the odd thing about it, in my case, was that I was going through the system successfully. I was a successful kid. I had a lot of friends. I was president of every class I was ever in. I was very good at school. I was very good with people. I was terrific at the work I did. I was successful. I lived in the right place. I lived in the right house, the right town. I did not belong. I wonder, what the hell am I doing here? And it persisted, and it was very strong. And if you've experienced that, you know that it centers here somewhere, and the wind blows, and it makes the days very long, and it makes the nights very dark. And I came to you, and I learned to pray. And in the 12 and 12 on the chapter on prayer, it says that perhaps one of the greatest benefits of prayer is the sense of belonging that comes to us. We are no longer lost or alone or frightened or purposeless. That despite all of the evidence in the world around us, we understand that a loving God watches over us, and that we know that when we turn to Him, all will be well with us here and hereafter. And I can tell you that that sense of belonging has come to me. And Cliff told you last night, and I tell you tonight, it isn't so much that you honor me by allowing me to speak to you. I belong here. I'm supposed to be here. This is where I belong. When I tell you that my name is Ray O'Keefe, and that I am an alcoholic, and I am a member of this program, what I am really telling you is who I am, what I am, and where I belong. Makes me feel good. A little later they came upon another prayer, and we have prayed that prayer together. And this time they prayed for themselves, but all they asked was peace of mind. And so they prayed God to grant them the serenity to accept the things they could not change. They did change. Something happened to these people. There was a great difference in their lives. There was a great difference between being drunk and being sober. There's a great difference in my life. There's a great difference in everyone's lives who comes here and puts this program into their lives and puts their lives into this program. And this difference between being drunk and being sober, they termed a spiritual awakening. And they had this spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. And these were the men and the women who at the beginning of this process admitted that they were hopeless and helpless and powerless. These were the ones who had no power, but having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, they found that they held in their hands and in their hearts and in this program one of the greatest sources of spiritual power that the world has ever seen. They actually had the power to arrest the disease of alcoholism. They actually had the power to save life And the only thing they were using was that great power of example of one drunk for another. And armed with that power, and having had that kind of a spiritual awakening, they began to carry the message to the alcoholic who still suffered. And they did that so well that you and I have come together on a night in April in 1987 in the magical city of Reno in the great state of Nevada. And that, my dear, dear brothers, is a long, long way from Akron, Ohio. And they knew what Cliff knows and Jimmy knows. They knew what my sponsor knows. They knew that what had been given to us was much more than just not drinking. They knew that what had been given to us was an entirely new way of living. And in order to enjoy that new way of life, they resolved that they would practice principles in all their affairs. And so where they had been, as I always was, very arrogant, they tried not to be so arrogant. Where they had been, as I always was, very dishonest, they tried not to be so dishonest. Happily for us all, they said we were not saints. They said that this is not a program of spiritual perfection. They said it is a program of spiritual progress. And my sponsor has instructed me, and so I believe that I can progress in the program if I don't drink and I go to the meetings. I could keep you now for another 3 or 4 days to tell you of all the wonderful things that have happened to me since I have become sober. I would not keep you that long. If you have a good wish for me, and I know that you do, please be assured that anything you might wish for me has already happened in my life. Every single thing that the disease of alcoholism took from me, every single position, every honor, every title, every appointment, and every dollar has been returned to me in the most marvelous and mysterious ways that I cannot even begin to tell you about. Every single thing that was ever taken from me has been given back with more. I have so many titles, you wouldn't even want to know about it. And I give you one other thing so you'll know how things are going with us. I bring you the warm and the fraternal greetings of 6 of my children who are members of Alcoholics Anonymous. I got my eye on that other guy. I would be remiss if I did not thank you and the committee and whoever else it was who had the very good judgment to bring me to speak at this dinner. I'd like you to know I arrived a very wealthy man, and I've become humble since. And it is a great honor, truly, to be here. And I enjoy it so much. I am, as you suspect, one of the members of Alcoholics Anonymous who I trot around after Jim and Cliff and Howie and to bring my little pathetic story with me. And everywhere I speak, I say the same thing. It's the only one I have. I make no apology for that. And when I end, as I do now, I talk about a pamphlet in Alcoholics Anonymous which is very dear to me. It's called The Member's View of Alcoholics Anonymous. At the end of that pamphlet, if you recall, the author takes a biblical turn. And he recalls the time when John the Baptist was once again languishing in one of Herod's prisons. And John sent two of his friends to inquire of his cousin Jesus as to whether or not he was the Messiah. And so these two men found the Lord, and they walked with him a while. And they stopped him one day, and they said to him, "Are you the Messiah? Are you the one that we have been waiting for thousands of years? Or should we wait for another?" And the Lord really didn't answer that question. But he said to these two men, "Go back to John and tell him everything you have seen and only what you have heard. Tell John that the blind see and the lame walk. And tell John that the deaf can hear and the sick are made well. And tell John that the poor have the gospel brought to them." In my early training, they said that the word poor in that context could be used as poor in spirit. And everyone knows that the word gospel simply means good news. And so, my dear brothers, here in Reno, and happy conference assembled, if you will accept a report from me based upon my years in Alcoholics Anonymous, I will tell you only what I have seen and only what I've heard. And based upon that observation, it seems to me that the blind do see and the lame do walk. And I know, and you know, that the sick are made well. And we understand that the deaf can hear. And I have seen over and over and over again, through the longest day and into the darkest night, the good news of our program brought to the alcoholic who still suffers, the poor in spirit. Thanks.